Okay, like I was saying, ASST is the story square. We come to the square to share our stories. We use our imaginations to pretend that we're in a square in our town, wherever we are. But with ASST, we're all gathered together in the story square. Jim Brulé is a Maggid, comes to us from New York, I'm sure in the country. He's a transformational storyteller and a death doula. His stories and students span the globe. His online storytelling school has been operating for many years. His stories are filled with challenge and mysticism that fills his repertoire. He inspires his audiences to heal and grow. Jim believes that the right kind of stories told with an open heart and an open mind, I'm sure, can be the basis for healing the rifts between us and within us. We welcome Brother Jim Brulé as he tells a cautionary tale of courage and resilience. Resilience. Yeah, resilience. The Oven of Akhnai. Jim Brulé, we're listening.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so great to be a part of this wonderful community. I do have an unusual story today. It's a sacred story, but it is sacred in a special way. It actually comes from Scripture. Now, you may not know this Scripture because this is part of the Jewish Scripture called the Talmud. And in fact, you might not know that there are two Talmuds, one written in Babylon and one written in Jerusalem. They're almost identical. We'll be hearing the one today from the Babylonian Talmud, which is what most people study. Now, it seems that years ago, when the great court, the Sanhedrin, was in session, that the rabbis would get together and they would argue about various points of law. And now in the Talmud, it's not necessary that everyone agree. You don't have to have a winning side. In fact, both sides or all the sides are recorded and the reader is allowed to choose whichever one they want. Except in this case, it's a very unusual case. And in this case, all the rabbis had gathered together to decide whether a particular oven, called the Oven of Akhnai, a snake, had to be managed with the laws of purity or not. We won't get into the case, because what's interesting is that all of the rabbis, except one, were agreed. It was subject to the laws of purity. But this one fellow, Eliezer, maintained that it wasn't. So, oddly, unusually, everyone felt that they had to convince Eliezer that he was wrong. And he just wouldn't give up. The Talmud tells us that they exhausted all the arguments in the world. And if you've ever heard a good group of Jews arguing, you know that took a very long time. But they couldn't reach an agreement. So they stepped out into the courtyard of the Sanhedrin, across which flowed this river. And in one side, there was a great tree, a great carob tree, surrounded by walls. And Rabbi Eliezer said, look, if I'm right, let this carob tree prove it. And as soon as he spoke those words, the carob tree lifted itself up out of the ground, flew across the courtyard, and planted itself on the other side. Now, I think that might have convinced me, but not the rabbis. They said, it's a tree. What does a tree know about the law? Well, Eliezer thought for a moment more, and he looked down on this stream that was running through the courtyard, and he said, if I'm right, let this stream, which flows from west to east, prove it. And as he spoke, the stream reversed its course and flew from east to west. You can probably guess the rabbi saying, it's a stream. What does it know about the law? So Rabbi Eliezer looks all around. He sees the walls of the great court there, and he says, look, if I'm right, let these walls, which have heard all of our arguments, let them give evidence. And as he spoke, the walls started to fall inwards. And Rabbi Joshua, who was the leader of the others, said, walls, you may not interfere with the arguments of rabbis. And at that, the walls stopped falling in, but they didn't straighten up either. So what do you do? What else could Eliezer do? But he lifted his voice to heaven and he said, if I'm right, let heaven prove it. And as soon as he spoke, a voice came down from the heavens and said, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And he's not just right about this, he's right about everything he said. Now, again, at this point, I would be convinced, but not Rabbi Joshua. He turned up to that heavenly voice and he said, God, you gave us the Torah. In fact, in the Torah, it says this is not on some mountain. It's not on across some great river. It's in our hearts. It's in our mouths for us. It's not yours anymore, God. It's ours. Politely saying, butt out. Now you might wonder how God would react to such a rebuke. It's said in the next part of this story that many years later, one of the great rabbis asked Elijah, the prophet, how had God reacted when he heard this rebuke? And Elijah reports, the Holy One laughed and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. And for those of us who are parents, we know that moment when our child finally thinks for themselves. And it's especially sweet when they disagree with us and they say, I have a different idea. We know then that they're standing on their own. And so it was with that pride that God laughed and said, my children have defeated me. Now you may remember that there are two Talmuds, and they're almost identical. That's how it's told in the Babylonian Talmud. But in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says, when God heard the rebuke, God wept and cried, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Why defeated? Not because of the disagreement, but because they couldn't agree with each other, that they insisted that everyone think the same way. And it was this lack of ability to think and stay together that caused the Holy One to weep. Now in Judaism, when we have two contradictory statements, which happens all the time, we're taught a very important lesson. And that is that they're both true. So in this case, we must imagine the Holy One both laughing and weeping as we disagree. Laughing because there are times when we can disagree and we can stay in community. And weeping because there are times when it tears us apart. So I invite each of you to disagree, but to stay in community. And let's make God laugh, not weep.